Great, thank you so much, everybody, for being here today, and right, not just across the country, but right across the world, even from Malaysia, and beyond, perhaps. So it's a privilege and a pleasure to be here today. Like was just said, my name is Jonathan Vincent, senior lecturer in the School of Education, Language and Psychology. And I fall within the education part of that. So I was formerly a teacher, but I've been working in some support provision, but also since 2013 in the School of Education as a lecturer. My main area of research really falls around autism and transitions, particularly transitions into university, through, and then out of. So over the last number of years, I've been focusing on that transition from out of higher education and into employment particularly. I also work at the minute as a coach, a job coach for a charity called Living Autism, so working with autistic adults either seeking employment or else perhaps in employment and sometimes experiencing difficulties. And as another sort of thing that was mentioned was this Pro Autism, which is a training group which was established in 2016 with or 2017, sorry, which is myself and some others, autistic, non-autistic people working together to develop understanding and better practices in the workplace for employers predominantly. And so it's important for us that it's not non-autistic people talking to employers, but it's a mix. It's autistic people advocating for themselves, and that really is really powerful. And we've been doing that for a number of years now. So it's like I said, a real pleasure to be here today, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the speakers, and it's been great listening to some of what's happened so far, and really enjoyed Joseph's film there. Lots of resonance with what I think I'll say. Yeah, I'm sort of thinking about then is this transition and the ecosystem particularly, and an ecosystem is, I suppose, one which comes out of this notion. I suppose the neurodiversity model is a good example of an ecosystem, and when Judy Singer was putting this together, she was really thinking about how an ecosystem is part of all of society, and is made up of different bits and pieces. I'm really sorry, I'm going to have to get a different one just to make this really clear, because otherwise it might be a bit of a jump. So what we tried to do was, myself and Mark Fabry, working at Leeds Beckett, and he'll be speaking later on, was try to think a little bit about how, for autistic graduates particularly, employment is not just something that happens in isolation, so it doesn't just happen for individuals in a particular place themselves, but is happening as part of a kind of a wider network. So we conducted a study which included speaking to 21 students and graduates, both making transitions out of higher education, and some of which had done that within 5 years. And we also spoke to a number of community stakeholders, in total 58 different stakeholders across 16 different focus groups. And what we wanted to do was to think through what was happening, this idea that employment doesn't happen in isolation, that it doesn't happen for just one person getting a job, but there are so many other people involved in that. And I think that was really clear from both what has been said earlier on today, from Joseph's film as well, this idea that there are a range of different people, all of whom are engaged in this process. And this came out of a number of different studies to some extent, some of which focused specifically just on transitions out of higher education, but built up over time, then thinking about the different types of factors and levers that might be involved in terms of getting a job, and some of the barriers and potential kind of strategies in relation to gaining competitive employment. So Mark and myself used these two quite large data sets to begin to think through a bit more about what is involved then for autistic graduates particularly. And what we thought was useful was considering the kind of this ecosystem idea, And this diagram gives a sense of what we've got here. And again, I apologize because I've messed up my slides a bit here. But what we can see is that we've got 6 different sort of graduated layers, if you like. So when we're thinking about who's involved in this process of employment, and who's involved in not just the beginning employment, but also progression within employment, there are a range of different stakeholders involved in that process, including at the most kind of proximal level, the closest to us, the autistic graduate, and then moving up, family and parents. Beyond that, the university and staff, including career services and disability practitioners and university lecturers and staff in academic departments. Supported employment, particularly in relation to both those who work for the third sector and also then perhaps career services where they extend beyond just the university in that way. Employers, and then ultimately the wider society. So these 6 different layers are operating at these different levels, and we sort of began to think about how this happens in both kind of the most proximal, the most close to us, but also those that are the most far away. And it's useful to see how these different groups of stakeholders might interact to some extent. We were thinking about how there is some of these groups and individuals might either create pathways to employment. So, for example, parents and family play a large part in that. Career services, for example, as well play a large part in that. And then also how there are potential barriers to employment, and that might be at a wider level, for example, in relation to understanding around employment. So we've got these kind of 6 different layers that we identified, but then we've also begun to think about how there are different people and practices and perspectives, perhaps, and we can kind of house them in. Whilst obviously people are in all of these different aspects, those who had the most impact based on our data tended to be those who were the autistic graduate themselves at the most kind of close level, their understanding of themselves, and also parents and family and the role that they played. So the people at that closest level were really those groups in terms of accessing employment, certainly based on our data, but that there might be studies that show others have a big impact as well. And then beyond that, the practices, and particular kind of practices equally which might lead to employment, or perhaps practices which create barriers to employment. And some career services, some university staff, some employers really went and developed things which are really super in terms of their practices, and offered a great deal of support in relation to what people were able to access, and put in place some really inclusive practices in relation to recruitment particularly, and accessing different resources as well as progression within the workplace. Equally, there was some suggestion that there are barriers in relation to those practices as well. So people play a part, practices in terms of what happens in a workplace, and what we're able to do, and the experience that people have was important. And then this kind of wider, and I suppose the most kind of distal, most distant, remote from us were kind of policies and perspectives. So how society at a broader level understands what autism is, if it does, and the implications that has. And those perspectives, they're part of society, so they're part of our practices, and people are all part of this kind of wider thing. So they're housed and sort of nested within these. So based on our study and our understanding of what the students and graduates were telling us, as well as these kind of other stakeholders, including parents and employers, supported employment providers, career services, etc., we're getting a sense that these things are nested. They're part of each other. They're all interconnected, like any kind of network, any kind of ecosystem would be, and they're intermingling. So whilst these sort of have separated them out in a kind of analytic way, that's not really how it works in real life. They're nested, and they give us a sense of how things all kind of flow and bleed into each other, but how important each of these different groups are in relation to autistic graduates making that transition to successful competitive employment, if that is what they want to do. The other factor that Mark and I considered was the element of time, and how time plays a huge role in relation to both people's experience of things, but also how then over time, and in some ways we could look at this backwards as well as forwards, because that's how time works, but certainly in relation to looking back, the repeated experiences of things have implications over time for how one feels about their potential to be successful. So it might be the case that examples of discrimination, or perhaps examples where things have been successful, over time give varying levels of confidence, or perhaps even a lack of confidence or a lack of trust. So in the study that we completed in 2020, which was about the ecosystem of competitive employment for university graduates with an autism diagnosis, this is kind of how we were approaching it. We were wanting to think about the connected nature of employment and that transition to employment, as well as the temporal nature and how time plays a part in that. And it's worth considering that, it's worth thinking about what's happened in the past and the implications that might have for self-concept, but also levels of confidence. I think there's at the minute a kind of a small but growing body of evidence that helps us think about these transitions into employment for autistic graduates, and it's an area that I think we need to know a lot more about, and conferences like this are such a great example, I think, of how we can do things differently and how we can think about practice, particularly, and which people are involved and how they can have an impact on these wider societal perspectives as well. But I think this is an area that we need to know an awful lot more about. There have been some fantastic interventions and initiatives and strategies put in place to enable autistic students to enter into and enroll in universities. I think that's been fantastic, but what we need to think about is what happens at the other end, and that's an area that there's a real need in relation to both research but also practice. So as I said, this was a study which Mark Fabry and I did, and we were thinking then about these different elements, this kind of ecosystem. And I want to share then just some of the data from that and pick out particularly some of the aspects around people, practices and perspectives, but how these intermingle with different groups. So let's see if that works for me. So I think it's, for me, it's always really important, and the privilege I have being able to do research and to talk to different people about their experiences. So I really want to share some of these with you. Thinking about this kind of inner section in terms of the ecosystem, the people, the autistic graduate themselves, I think, is one of the most important, if not the most important person in relation to this kind of ecosystem. This individual in our focus group said the reason it's draining is because you're so busy focusing on your body language, your behavior, trying not to say anything inappropriate, creating that coverage to pass as normal. And I think this speaks to the kind of the embodied nature of being autistic in the workplace, or being autistic applying for jobs. And I think that really came across in terms of Joseph's film earlier on, in terms of the sensory experience that the character in that experienced as having to try and pass, having to try and look neurotypical and act neurotypical, and having not disclosed anything to pass as normal, but finding that incredibly difficult, but also incredibly draining. And I think it's that both emotional drain in terms of having to keep that going as often as you feel you need to, but also even the physical drain that can have on an individual, I think is kind of really significant. And it's constantly having to watch yourself and think about all of these different things, the body language, your behavior, what you say, etc. Just the level of stress and emotional labor that goes into that, I think is really significant, and is something to keep in mind. So there were challenges, I guess, and that embodied experience of autism in terms of the sensory experience, the social experience, etc., can be a real challenge. And certainly based on some of the coaching that I've done more recently with autistic people in work or looking for work, one of the things that they've talked about is not just the experience in itself, the day, but actually the day after, the experience of having to be engaged very socially and then feeling utterly wiped out the day after, and how it's not just as easy as navigating a social situation. It's the implications that has for the following days, perhaps. So in the context of work, I guess, where you're working Monday to Friday and there's no let up, I guess that's one of the challenges in relation to access to work, in terms of its flexibility, perhaps, and the need for space and time to be able to recover from this. I'll talk a little bit more about disclosure, because I think that idea of kind of passing as normal, in inverted commas, is important as well, about whether one feels comfortable disclosing their diagnosis to others, and how that can have varying, that can open up opportunities, but can also potentially close things down. So for some, they recognise the challenges involved in being autistic in this process, and how there was a great deal of emotional labour that went into it. Other people saw it in terms of not something that they felt. They didn't see it in that way. In fact, it was different. They didn't consider themselves to be disabled. In fact, they saw that their autistic traits offered advantages, offered things that were really positive. So again, just in the same way, an embodied experience, but perceived very differently. And I think that speaks to the diversity in terms of how autistic people both are, in terms of these, the wide range of ways that things are experienced, and how those things are experienced differently, depending on the individual, depending on the context, depending on even the time in the day, perhaps, that it's not going to be the same, but certainly that their perception of their autism diagnosis isn't going to be the same, that not everybody sees that as an advantage, but some people certainly do, and some people would not want to disclose their autism diagnosis to employers. Some would feel more comfortable doing that. Some wouldn't see themselves as disabled, as this individual said, because they don't see it as a disability, as a something which gives disadvantage, and they want to reframe that. I think sometimes this can come due to people's experiences over time. If they've had positive experiences where that has been affirmed and reaffirmed, then I think they have a sense of identity where there are advantages attached to that. And conversely, where some people have experiences over time where that hasn't been the case, that can be much more difficult. It's an interesting one in terms of how people perceive it, but it certainly is the case that the autistic graduate is right at the heart of this, and how they perceive themselves and their autistic traits, and the things that are challenging perhaps to them within different contexts, is absolutely fundamental to this. So they're at the very heart of this. There are other people, though, who also form these networks of support. And I think what's happening today is a really good example of this. This graduate said, "At my university, I've been part of a 10-week employability workshop. What I found most useful was the mock interviews. We met people from the council and they interviewed us like it was a proper job." So these networks of support that go around the graduate were perceived as being really important. So part of this, the next layer up, if you like, in terms of our ecosystem, but also part of people. This idea of kind of having career services, having disability practitioners, having university lecturers, having a better sense, and employers as well, having a better understanding of what autism is, but also putting in place sort of specific and timely support in relation to what the needs of these individual autistic students or graduates needed. particularly for the kinds of jobs that they were going to apply for. I think, from what I've seen today, this is why people are here. This is why different employers and career services and others are engaged. And organisations like AGCAS, I think, are doing a great job in terms of moving towards a better understanding of what works for employability. I did a study recently which mapped the provision for 120 different higher education institutions based on what was published on their website during a particular window of time. And interestingly, employability was one of these which was which was relatively low in terms of what universities were doing. And I think this is changing, but I think it's still, like I said, it's an area where we need to think, and we are thinking about what could be useful for this group in particular. Another one of the things that I really struck me from watching Joseph's film earlier was the other character, Sam, who really demonstrated, I think, that quality of allyship. What this graduate said was, one of my other co-workers, she was really understanding. One time when a customer told a joke, she actually explained the joke to me by whispering it in my ear. And I was like, thanks for that. And she was just like, it's okay, my cousin's autistic. So this idea of having people, not just more formal support, but informal support in the workplace. What I've seen is that in the UK and internationally, there's been a big shift towards perhaps more inclusive and more positive views around autism, but sometimes they can be top-down. And so a managing director or a CEO decides this is what we want to do, and that's really positive. And often that's because they might have a connection to autism within their family or something else. But one of the challenges is the individuals on the ground, the people with whom people are working. It's not always top down. So it's about co-workers. It's about people coming alongside, people gaining an understanding and having an understanding, of being open to understanding each other and the needs that individuals have, and perhaps even in some ways fulfilling this function of interpretation or navigation. In this case, I think that really comes across, this ally in the workplace, navigating and interpreting for this young woman what was happening and why that was funny, and therefore including her, opening up an inclusive space for her. So from this study, our data could suggest that people form such an important part, both in terms of formal support but also informal support. The practices that we considered, and in total we had a really large data set, so we were looking at like thousands and thousands of words of data. Practices, particularly barriers to employment, was the largest coded set of data. So it was the one that most people identified as being problematic. What this graduate said here is, by the time I got my current job, I'd fired off over 100 applications. I had about 10 or 15 interviews out of those. Other people talked about having applied for thousands of jobs and being turned down for a lot of those. And so the practices in relation to accessing employment were typically focused on the recruitment processes, the application, the job specification, the interview, the induction process, and sometimes even the progression within the job and being successful within the workplace once an individual has a job. There were a whole range of barriers, and they tended to be around these different things, but often in relation to decoding application forms, making sense of what it is the individual wants, or the company wants. Perhaps as well about the interview process and trying to make sense of what it is that the interviewer is wanting to get from that person in that context. One of the challenges again is to do with disclosure sometimes, because unless a company knows that that someone is autistic and they feel comfortable and happy to disclose that, then it's really challenging for them to make reasonable adjustments. And in lots of cases, that certainly doesn't happen, and that makes this process much more problematic. Sometimes, again, disclosure can be open things up, but it can also close things down. In this case, I told my manager that I had Asperger's, and I find it really hard if you don't give me an ordered list. But he didn't. He kept saying my memory was rubbish, making fun of Asperger's, turning it into a joke in the workplace. About a month into it, he brought my application form upstairs and went, "What's this? We know it's been proven Asperger's doesn't exist. It's all in your head. You're making it up." And sadly, there were many experiences where people had really poor experiences in the workplace that they felt were, and probably were, discrimination. Just discrimination. People either not giving them opportunities, or perhaps even when they had an opportunity, they were being diminished in terms of their identity. They were being delegitimized in terms of what it meant to be autistic, and they felt isolated and excluded in the workplace. And I think that's why having people, having co-workers who are allies, having managers who have understanding and can put in place the types of things that will make someone successful is so important. These practices are absolutely crucial. But again, we mentioned this idea of time. Over time, if this happens again and again, where people are discriminated against in relation to getting a job, or if they are made to feel like their autistic identity is not legitimate, is not a thing, then it will over time have an impact in terms of their self-concept and how able they feel personally in terms of accessing work. That said, there were some really positive examples in terms of practices, and these practices related to employers where there was a positive shift in terms of culture, and GCHQ was particularly mentioned for one person, and they were very proactive about recruiting people on the spectrum because they see the advantages. They thought it was a positive thing. And we're seeing a shift in relation to different organisations. JP Morgan was mentioned earlier on as well, and NHS was mentioned in that last video. So we're seeing that some organisations, usually quite large ones, are moving towards a more inclusive, towards a more positive view of what it means to be autistic, and the advantages that might be gained through recruiting people who have particular cognitive profiles and can add something which other non-autistic people wouldn't be able to do. So I think we're seeing a bit of a shift. Sometimes that's maybe more within certain sectors, banking, IT, etc. And I think there's space for those creative industries to start seeing how autistic people can also offer advantages in those types of industries as well. I think what's really important is how we get these big organizations, they are able to lead the way, and then smaller, probably less financially not secure, but these other kind of smaller companies can follow and see, well, if it works for them, or if it's an advantage for them, then perhaps this is something we need to think about changing, and it begins to open up then different conversations about adjustments and recruitment processes, and making sure that they have the best of the talent available. This employer. This supported employment provider said it's useful for employers to know, and it's useful for them to know. If everybody knows, then I can come in and we can job carve and help and support that person to be the best employee they can be. So what was fundamental was this idea of disclosure, and this supported employment provider was saying, as a job coach, if I don't know, or rather, if employers don't know, I can't go in and I can't say to them, these are the reasonable adjustments this individual needs. This is what will help them to be successful in the interview. This is what will help them be successful as they progress through their roles. etc. So it's absolutely fundamental for them to be able to disclose. But as I said, this is a challenge because for some individuals, disclosure is something they feel comfortable with, and they feel that their diagnosis is an advantage and something they want to share. And for other people, that isn't the case. And it's difficult, and especially because over time, people's experiences might have been that they have disclosed and they feel that they have been discriminated against. So it's a very difficult one to navigate and to know when is it right to disclose and to whom and in what way, and at what point is that useful to do. But certainly from a job coach's perspective, it's important to be able to do that so that we can get all of these adjustments in place and to make it possible for an autistic graduate to be successful in the workplace. And I think disclosure is a big thing that we need to consider and think about. The final one then was around policy and perspectives. And there is a real lack of understanding, but not just employers, but by peers, by employees, by society. So this idea that there is space for us to understand and to know more was really kind of central for those who took part in the study, to say it's not just about employers, it's not just about people reading more about stuff in the papers or in the media, but it's about understanding, and that's different to awareness. It's not enough just to be aware of it, it's that we need to be understanding of each other and become allies, such that we can support people to be successful in whatever it is they want to and choose to do. So a few things just to pull out from this then. Successful employment transition requires collaborative relationships at every level and across all stakeholder groups. So it is the autistic student and graduate, it is parents and family potentially, it's employers, it's careers advisors, it's disability support workers, it's all of these different groups at these different levels all working together to come to a solution. And I think that takes the pressure off to some extent the individual autistic student or graduate feeling like they have to get a job. We need to work together to do that. These practices that were recognised as being most enabling were specialist support, workplace adjustments, advocacy, and being an ally. And I think just having someone that is able to advocate for you, perhaps when you don't feel able to do that, was really important. And then finally, enhanced understanding at a societal level. And this offers greater understanding, which brings with it more possibilities for disclosure, but also pathways to better opportunities in relation to employment. What we've got here is just, these are a few little videos just from Pro-Autism, which, as I said, is both autistic people and non-autistic people working together, and that fits in this final thing to say it's about developing understanding, and for that to come from autistic people as well as others to try and shift the way that we think about autism in the workplace. So it leaves me just to say thank you very much, and my apologies for the beginning there and for getting my slides mixed up. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here today, and if you'd like to read the full paper you can, or there's also an open access preprint version which I'll make available to you. So thank you very much everyone, and wish you a very good day.